you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Before I bring up the PowerPoint presentation, I just want to thank Josiah for the introduction, and of course thank FCOS and particularly Vani for the invitation to speak today. And furthermore, thank the UNDP and UKA for sponsoring this event. I've only got about 15 minutes, so I'll jump straight into it. I understand that Sally is in the room waiting to speak after me. I can see her turning her head there, so that's wonderful. Good to see her. Just let me know if you can see that presentation on your screen, Josiah.
Yes, Michael.
Okay, that's great. So my name is Mike McDonald. I'm from Child Fund Australia, and just to give you a very short background, Child Fund Australia and FCOS have been working together under the Australian Humanitarian Partnership, which is financed by DFAT for the past 2, 3, 4 years or thereabouts. There are 2 phases of AHP, and we're just about to come to the end of the first. So talking to accountability to affected populations is something very topical for both Child Fund Australia and FCOS. The first time that's really come to the fore has been through the TC YASA response that, of course, you're all familiar with. So we will be talking to something today that both organisations, again, are very much focused on. The objectives of this presentation, again, just to better understand accountability to affected populations, understanding that many people in the audience, I'm sure, have had a lot to do with this particular subject matter. Just wanted to set the foundations for accountability to affected populations. I think it's fair to say that this is very much ground within human rights. And when we talk about human rights, as again, I'm sure you know, we are talking about accountability, but specifically, we're talking about 2 groups, rights holders and, of course, duty bearers. In this particular case, in the humanitarian setting, we often look at individuals and households as rights holders, people who have legitimate claims. And when we talk about duty bearers, we're talking about state and non-state actors, and many people would argue that civil society actors are also those who are duty bearers, keeping in mind that all human beings are rights holders under the Declaration of Human Rights. The reason I bring this up is because for me and Child Fund Australia, accountability to affected populations is very much a conversation around power. And it's very important, I think, to understand or acknowledge the power disparity between affected populations and those who are serving them, and what bridges or reduces that power gap. Just looking at the humanitarian architecture that allows us to look through the prism of rights. I've talked about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, the UN was established in the same year, in 1948. Moving through this very quickly, we have the 1949 establishment of the Geneva Conventions, and something we'll be talking about today, the Code of Conduct for International Red Cross and Red Cross Movement and NGOs in disaster relief. Keeping in mind this was only drafted and approved in 1994, not that long ago. We'll be talking about the Sphere Standards and the Humanitarian Charter today as well. Again, only established in 1998. And I'll touch upon the Humanitarian Standards Partnership as well in 2015. In summary on this slide, again, it's fair to say that the conversation around human rights is definitely not new. However, I do think that the humanitarian architecture in relative terms is particularly new, and even newer within that is accountability to affected populations, as we see with the establishment of the Humanitarian Standards Partnership in 2015. Just looking a little bit closer at the Code of Conduct for the International Red Cross and Red Cross Movement and NGOs in disaster relief, there are 10 components or 10 principles to this Code of Conduct. I've just identified 2 that resonate with today's conversation and hopefully what you have been discussing over the past 2 days. Principle 7 there relates to the involvement of beneficiaries, and point 9 talks about accountability, particularly accountability to those we seek to assist. And secondly, and I would always argue secondly, to those from whom we receive resources. Often this is turned on its head such that we feel more accountable to those from whom we see from whom we receive resources rather than to those that we assist. And again, I go back to that point around power disparities. Donors often have more power over the organizations they're giving funds to, and providers of service in the field often have more power over the affected population. Bridging those power gaps is absolutely critical, acknowledging that it's very difficult to do, especially if you are a member of the affected population. Moving sequentially, we've touched upon the Code of Conduct from 1994. I did touch upon the Humanitarian Charter from 1998. We'll go to that very quickly, and it does mention in the Humanitarian Charter that it is the ethical and legal backdrop to the protection principles, the core humanitarian standard, which I'll come to, and the associated minimum standards. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the humanitarian architecture has left us with a great foundation from which to think about accountability in affected populations. I'll unpack that a little bit further throughout the presentation. Looking a bit closer at the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, again, this was established in 2015. I'll provide a quote from 2017 that, again, looks to unpack accountability and to whom. So reading that out loud, the essence of accountability is to respect the needs, concerns, capacities, and situation of the people they aim to assist or that we aim to assist, and to be answerable for our actions and decisions to these people and other stakeholders. The question is, what are we accountable for? Again, relying upon the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, in short, we are accountable to a number of things, but primarily, of course, establishing and delivering on commitments that we make through our strategic plans, through project proposals, as related to communities themselves. We have the obligation and we make the commitment to ensure that our staff have the capacity to do the job as we've committed to doing it. Critically, for this conversation, we have the commitment and we are accountable for sharing information. And point 4 there, ensuring that communities who are affected do participate in decision-making, project design, etc. We are accountable to handling complaints in a competent manner, and we as organisations have the obligation to continue learning and to continue improving. I'll now switch from the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership established in 2015 to what the IASC says with respect to the commitments on accountability to affected people and the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. These commitments are very similar to the ones on the previous slide. Here we talk about leadership, but again, critically, we talk about partnership and participation, information sharing, feedback, and action. The fourth one there that I won't go into so much is results. I really want us to focus on 2 and 3. Trying to unpack participation and partnership a little bit. Again, within the IASC document, it talks about mechanisms through which affected people, affected populations are able to participate and play an active role in decision making. Going to the very big question of localization, point 2 relates directly to that. We need to adopt and sustain equitable partnerships with local actors, so as to build relationships that are established on trust, and that can only be done if we are committing to a long term, of course. Looking at information, feedback, and action. Again, this repeats what we saw on the previous slide to a certain degree. We need to have mechanisms through which the affected population can participate in decision making and initiative design, for example. We need to have appropriate mechanisms through which people can provide their feedback, acknowledging that some of that feedback may be quite sensitive and may relate to issues such as PSEAH, which I know most people in the room are very familiar with. And through those mechanisms that allow the affected population to engage with decision making and project design, initiative design, hopefully we'll be producing initiatives that respond to the protection assistance needs of the affected population, number 1, and critically respond to the protection and assistance needs of those groups who are most vulnerable and or most marginal, acknowledging that there is great diversity within the communities that we serve. So we've talked about the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership. I've touched very briefly upon the IASC principles as they relate to accountability to affected populations and PSEAH. I'll now go to the core humanitarian standards, which we touched upon briefly previously. I'm sure many people are familiar with this design. So around the outside, we have the 9 commitments of the core humanitarian standards. On the inside, humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. We have the first 4 principles of the Red Crescent, Red Cross movement and NGO Code of Conduct. I highlight that because I just wanted to mention the very clear link, again, between that humanitarian architecture and documents that we use to operationalize that architecture. Today, we will not be focusing on all 9 of those commitments. We'll be focusing just on 4 and 5. And I say that because they directly relate to accountability to affected populations. In the best interest of time, I'll move ahead quickly. So commitment 4 at the top end there talks about people in crisis and how we have the commitment to ensure that they know their rights and their entitlements. If you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights and documents associated with it, it does unpack those rights. that are relevant to people within disaster, especially in reference to basic needs. Just touching upon the first 2 points there, again, communities and people affected by crisis know their rights and entitlements. And those same people have timely access to clear and relevant information. More often than not, within times of disaster, there is a huge information gap, particularly within communities. And the only way that they can get that often is through those organizations, whether they be government or civil society, or in fact private, that are there to serve the affected population and affected communities. Just coming to point 4 there, again, going back to what has previously been mentioned, it is absolutely critical that we are not assuming that staff understand this well, and that organisations are focused through their capacity building with staff on ensuring that they understand what the rights of the affected population actually are. Going to Core Humanitarian Standard Commitment 5. This touches upon complaints mechanisms. Some people refer to complaints as sensitive feedback. I touched upon this in the previous slide, or a previous slide, when we discussed PSEH, complaints or sensitive feedback. So of course, affected communities need to be aware of complaints mechanisms. They need to be user-friendly, and they need to have trust in these mechanisms. And one very good way to ensure that trust is established is to ensure that if and when your organisation receives feedback, particularly sensitive feedback, that we do our utmost to follow up on that feedback and provide a response to the affected population and or the affected individual, particularly when that complaint is sensitive. Just unpacking what is feedback. As mentioned, information from the community, from an individual, going back to our organisations. It may be positive, it may be negative, it may be neutral. It may come through face-to-face, it may come through social media, it may come through the telephone. There's a whole range of different kinds of feedback: questioning services, rumours, myths. A lot of it may be presented formally, but the majority, I think, to be fair, and as people who work on the ground, you would know this, a lot of it tends to be informal. Just looking at this diagrammatically, I want you to focus on the part of the Venn diagram in purple, which talks directly about community feedback and how that links into meaningful participation, number 1, and the provision of information, which again, I think has been a very strong focus for the group over the past 2 days. We've spoken about the different kinds of feedback that can be provided face-to-face, through focus groups, community groups, call centres, household visits, etc. These are some of the mechanisms through which feedback can be provided. We've spoken about, very briefly, provision of information, and we've touched upon meaningful participation. Without all 3, not just community feedback, we will not have sufficient accountability to populations or affected populations. Some of the things to consider when we're trying to establish accountability mechanisms that function well, particularly for affected populations. Of course, we don't treat communities generically. As mentioned previously, there is great diversity within our communities. We have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that there are barriers for certain people to providing feedback to us, particularly sensitive feedback or complaints. We have to be mindful on how to include those people within these mechanisms. Rather than creating brand new mechanisms that may be unfamiliar to a lot of people in community, it's important to acknowledge what already exists within the communities in which we work. In order to do that, it's wise to carry out an assessment. Many people in the room have been involved in risk communication and community engagement initiatives under COVID-19. This is no different with respect to understanding the information that communities are receiving now, what they view to be a priority, how often they receive information, through what means they receive it, how the community would like to or does share information with the organizations in which we work, and again, what are the mechanisms that different members of the community prefer when providing feedback to us. Moving very quickly, again, I've touched upon the face-to-face mechanism. We have questions desks, we have community committees that can be established in order to seek feedback through radio shows, social media, which of course we're all very familiar with. I've touched upon a phone line or a text line that can be used, feedback through suggestion boxes, which are not as common as they once were. They're not, in my experience, as effective as they might be. Many organizations consequently choose not to use them these days. So probably 4 or 5 mechanisms, some working better than others, given the context. How do we respond to feedback as organizations? Of course, it's critical that communities understand how we will respond to them. And our answers need to be direct and critically actionable. From a community member's perspective, of course, they prefer not to receive abstract answers from organizations. They want something that is concrete and, again, critically actionable. There'll be many questions that organizations will not be able to answer. These questions may need to be referred on, but again, it's important that we inform community members who we're referring those questions to and when they'll receive feedback. Talking about who we respond to, again, if the information that we're receiving and responding to is sensitive, most likely it'll be at an individual basis rather than a community level. That can be done, of course, face-to-face, via telephone, etc. If we're responding to the entire community, then we can do that through means of mass media, including posters, community meetings, bulletin boards, radios, etc. And we need to keep our feedback or our response as anonymous as possible, e.g. not so much mentioning the names of those people who have provided feedback for very obvious reasons involving confidentiality, particularly when that feedback is of an extremely sensitive nature. My last slide will be a look at a diagram developed by the IFRC, which very simply takes you through positive feedback and also negative feedback or sensitive feedback. There should be no surprises here. However, I just want to point out that, again, in that second or third box down, when it says, is it sensitive feedback? I'm hoping that each organization has a complaints mechanism that is able to deal efficiently, effectively, and confidentially with that sensitive information, whether it referred to PSEH, for example, or issues surrounding SGBV. Okay, I've probably gone beyond time. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'll hand over to Ciali.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Michael, thank you very much for doing very comprehensive presentations. We agree that Michael and myself will share the space this morning, but I think he has done the whole lot of explaining what the standards relating to accountability to affected populations in disaster. Although I thought presentation, and this is just like to, you know how we learn in the Pacific, we don't learn from textbooks. So we learn by following our grandparents to the bush, to farms and you know, doing errands here and there for our mothers and our grandmothers while they're doing the weaving or the farming. So this is really how we have seen Yapo network in our journey around material organization and how we understand the principles that Michael has talked about and the attempt that we made to translate it to what it would look like in terms of how we need to track, see the changes that is happening from one point to another in terms of how we see our partners, how we see the donors, and how we see the work that we do ourselves in terms of pushing or progressing humanitarian mobilization. The next slide. So really, this is just a map to show you that this is where Piango works. But I like to tell people that you know, Piango efforts and everyone that is part of our family is we are the Pacific, yeah. Because this map just shows how we are present. Not all of our members like efforts where they have paid staff or office and a strong board. Some of our members in other part of the Pacific, it's only a group of volunteers who are doing, you know, form themselves as a board, responding to engaging with government to a point that we already have some of our members in other countries, for example, like in Nauru, where it speaks to how government is restricted the civic space in enabling environment that civil society operates. So we have like a one-man band in some of the countries, just because it's government is not supporting their work. And we are a member of umbrella NGOs in those 24 countries and territories. We had a little bit of context in how we operate in our region. For those of you that are not really following how our region's geopolitics, the Micronesian countries are leaving the forum. Some of our countries are still under the influence of foreign powers, like New Caledonia, Kanaki, Guam, in the Micronesia. But our Piango family doesn't recognize this. Yeah? We recognize each of our countries that as members of Piango to stand alone in their own right. And so it does not, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat doesn't define us. Yeah? We define ourselves as our connection to our other part of our Pacific is based on the people, not based on any political influence or power. Next slide. This is a bit not clear, But what it does reflect is just reflect the journey that we have with EFCOS. This slide is going to be available to all of you, but it shows that perhaps you can see 2015 up to 2021. It shows the journey that we had with EFCOS and our other members of Piango when it comes to humanitarian localization. Yeah. And if you think that you are going to be in this journey for 2 years and then you go to sleep, think again whether you want to engage. Yeah? But this is a long haul. It's going to be an ongoing journey in terms of pushing for systemic change. And it's going to be an exciting journey. There's a couple of dates here that you may be able to look at. For example, in there has been one lately, the webinar series that was done by Michael, EFCOS and Piango. But it just shows, this journey just shows a snapshot of some of the points where we all come together. And I think that's one of the learnings that we have seen with COVID-19 is that it's a new appetite within partners to collaborate. And I think that EFCOS has done a great job in leverage some of those opportunities. Right. This is the principle that EFCOS, Piango, and our members has decided that we will work in those areas for the Pacific. It's not clear on the slide, but what it says there that it has 7 key areas that we decided that we need to start looking at measuring how does change focus on. One is partnership, the other one is leadership, capacity, complementarity and coordination, funding, participation, policy influence and advocacy. So those were the 7 key areas that we decided, okay, what does humanitarian localization mean to us? Let's try and see those 7 areas in practice. How does the change go? And then we started by looking at the methodology, the slides on the side, the diagrams on the side, where we start looking at signposts. Yeah? And we see in each of the journeys that we had, there would be signposts where we could all stop and reflect on what has changed. Next slide, Brian. In 2019, EFCOS had decided to support the work that we do by doing a localization baseline. This was done by EFCOS themselves. I think it was Mosese that was helping my team, Josiah, another Josiah. I like to call this as Josiah A. And then of course there's another Josiah. And you can place him in the alphabet whichever way. But this is the kind of work that we had done, that we had supported efforts to develop their baseline. On the other side, there was also I think that was PC Ita, where our team from Piango had gone in there. What they had managed to collect was stories from the community. And you can see one of the highlights from that, or the key takeaway from that bit of research was the resilience of our traditional Pali. In all the land group, there's most of the modern formations just being damaged by the cyclone Ita. The only valley that was still around was the one with our traditional. But you know, the funny thing is that you never seem to give this kind of information to inform how our government is responding to cyclones. We have not seen any of our government, not just Fiji, across the Pacific, rebuilding our houses with our traditional. There's always a Western. So this is the kind of information that we need to bring out of the community, to inform how we are responding, to tell the story of our resilience. Next slide, please. So in the baseline, this is what it looks like in terms of the tracking. Yeah? Partnership, leadership, coordination, complementarity, policy implemented for partnership, funding, and capacity. And you can see across, you have Fiji on the first column, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu, and the rest is like you're summing up the whole whole four countries. Why we did all these countries? Because in the what we call the hotspot in our Pacific, these are the core. It's always every year. It's either come from Solomon Islands around Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga. Yeah, that's the kind of trends. But you will see in terms of the baseline, this is how they see localization effort in Canada. Yeah? And you see Fiji, it has a big and a small peak, which is limited to some. That's how they are rating. These are all available on the research. Josiah can share that with everyone. I just want to make a point in how we are using principle-based to do research or to inform how we see ourselves in terms of our attempt to make sure that locally led development is part of our work in the humanitarian sector. After 4 years, I think it would be 3 years because it was 2019. Then this report has just come out yesterday. So I'm stealing some of these ideas. It's not been launched yet. It's launched next week. That's okay. This is our task that we do whatever we want to do. Yeah? But the report is called Namuka Watanabe Kua. The idea is that to demonstrating change on locally led humanitarian action in the Pacific. And you will see in this part of the research that we do, it's always some translations concept that we try to make sure that is in there. Because we believe that when you translate some of these ideas, it makes sense to us. Yeah? So at this point in time, we are saying, okay, this is the end line. Let's check the pulse. Eh? Where are we in terms of our humanitarian localization? And this is the outcome of that. You see partnership. So you see the box. That's the baseline. The circle is where we are now. Yeah, with our checking the pulse exercise. Partnership, there was really improved. Yeah? You see there's a circle. Funny enough, leadership seems to be standing still. Coordination and complementarity is improved. Policy influence and advocacy improved. Participation has been improved. The funding, not only that it stays the same, but it's still at a very important end there. Capacity, same. So what does that mean? Is that what does it mean is that we are now in the tracking where we are in terms of, and this report is available. You guys can have a look at it and read it. It's quite interesting. But let's take a look in Fiji. Just have the next slide, please. What it does is explain What are the things that has happened in Fiji that might give us an idea why the standing still and the progressing in the last slide? Yeah? It's interesting how we had been blessed in Fiji. 2020, 2021 is like the year for ASEAN Fiji. Yeah? And I often don't like to talk about this because this is just a year that I have taken up my new role in piano. And I feel responsible for what's happening in Fiji. Like I have brought all of this crisis. April 2020, Cyclone Harbour. 180 affected, 1 death. Kacivaka, December 2020, 93,000, 4 deaths. January 2021, Cyclone Anna, 14,700, 2 deaths, 3 missing. And then we have COVID. 52,506 confirmed cases, 696 deaths. And this is the information that has been from end of November this year. The reason that has given here is part of the snapshot, the pulse checking, that the key challenges in Fiji, in particular in this snapshot, is that the role of the pandemic has kind of given the government to lead the response without using the mechanisms and existing structures, as in the humanitarian sector. And that has given the civil society not a clear direction of how they need to engage in the response. The local civil society actors, especially small organizations, are not being resourced adequately. Taking localization forward in Fiji as a key opportunity, the pockets of emerging promising practices need to be scaled up, as they have already been tested and it seems to work. Greater investment needs to be made in strengthening civil society coordinations. Yeah, I think that is really a key ask that we would like to see supported efforts because of the coordination role that they have. And so, again, it looked into positive development as well, in terms of localization has greater prominence amongst local civil society and international actors key to discuss and plan how they provide more support for locally led. So you still see the message that's coming out, still pushing for support for locally led actions. This is one example of how we progress. We've done the baseline, we have the snapshots of where things are. This is an example of how we get also from civil society to the monitoring of how the response to COVID. That was Kantaru was Disney Herald.
Herald, yes.
So Disney Herald, we managed to get some funding from UNICEF because they wouldn't even get the information that they wanted from government. Can you believe it? And so they come to Piango to get some people to go and get the information from Kantaru. They can't even do a short, yes, they have to go around the bush, come around, and get the data. And so we managed to get efforts. Sebati was leading the team. Then they went to Piango and efforts went to Kantaru, collect the youth in Kantaru, collect the data. We were supposed to go back and present the outcome of the report to the traditional leaders in Kantaru and the community, but because of the second wave, we were not able to do so. But we have already had the report available. It is quite interesting how you see that even the agencies, even the UN, they still struggle to get information from our government. This is not just Fiji, across the Fiji, it was Fiji that we work with and Vanuatu. And to make it safe enough is that Vanuatu has an information act that they had probably tell the rest of the world that they got it. But when it comes to sharing information and how it's being used to access information and to promote the transparency of what they do in the community, even to the UN system, is still a challenge. But then, well, of course, it's already stepping into that. And now there's an ongoing conversation with UNICEF that they need to continue to support this kind of work where we do third-party monitoring. So we are kind of making sure that we ensure that the humanitarian responses really reach the affected community. That's our accountability, holding government and holding agencies to account. So how do we monitor humanitarian actors to ensure that humanitarian actors are accountable to our affected communities and populations and communities? Again, this is what we can do, and we have done it. So there's a possibility to continue, not just in Fiji, but across the region. I just want to bring this, it's still an early stage. Pear is now a member of the STAR network, for those of you who have got some affiliated with STAR network. STAR network is a network of international civil society, human actors, save the children, of the you name it. They're all part of this huge network. They contributed their own money into that, and then they supported. Young all people have been accepted to be a member of STAR network. We don't have a penny to contribute like every other people, but we have been telling them we have the stories of the Pacific that we can come to the table with them. So that's a kind of work that we need to equip ourselves. We may not have the money, but that's okay. We can still sit at the table with other partners just by knowing our stories and knowing our people. And that's the next step that we have. They have this program that is called anticipatory actions. It's still an early stage to talk about it, but it has been tested in Pakistan, I think it is Nepal. What they did, they used the data, the weather information, then they you know how you have a cyclone, and then you look at the breakfast tree and says like 4 fruits in 1 glance. Yeah, this is how you can merge the science and your traditional knowledge, and then predict what it would look like. So we are trying to change the narrative from being reactive to push for the donors to invest in our community, so they can be more proactive. They have something that they would already predict from how they understand the trend in our cyclones and all that, addition to the weather science information, and then through a program, what they call anticipatory actions, and the money is available. EFCOT had done a few weeks ago, the contingency planning exercise. That's the trigger. Yeah? So it's still all over the place, and most of the time I don't really know what I'm doing, but this is how it can be connected at some point, so that we shifted our conversation from just talking about data to collect data and who's going to look after the data and all this, but we use the data for our own advantage, preparing our community. It's a whole step up of preparedness. Sorry, because I have not too much. Thank you very much.
On the two presentations. I would just like to thank the for that wonderful presentation and also sharing our experience, the typical way to do things that we really learn to experience and also like to thank her for being tackling all these issues head on and work to a lot of places, and I'm inspired by our leaders who are women, and it is really great to see that we have something to a lot of people around that we can learn from. Thank you so much. Thank you. Any takers in the room?
Thank you again, Michael, and thank you, Chair. Your last bit on proactive programs. We are right now in the middle of the second season. It's a pity that we had to deal with COVID throughout the year when we could have continued the momentum that we had in terms of the work that we did TCRs and TCR. We had really good preparations toward that in terms of the DRM meeting that happened here, and we couldn't have it for Eastern, and we didn't have it for the North as well. One of the things that was discussed yesterday is to continue this as we can strengthen our coordinations in the divisions as well. Hopefully, this is something that we can work towards. We're all in proactive approach as well. There's a lot that can be done in terms of market analysis within our divisions to know what we have, and also to prepare our markets and the people in terms of any humanitarian response that need to happen. And that might mean a lot more survey, and equally important is the analysis that needs to happen afterwards, so that we can convince our donor. The proactive approach can only be strengthened if these donors have a political will to be able to repurpose some of the fund or start pivoting some of the fund to look at coordinations and the work that's already happened on the ground to be supported, and also other people can be supported as well in terms of making it happen and bringing these ideas, these discounts to life at the customer.
Thank you. Sorry, madam, I will hold you there. We'll take one more question, and then we'll give you the time for respond, and also for Michael if it's you.
Thank you both, Diane and Michael. Good presentation, great presentations on, just accountability. The topic of today's accountability, even though today is International Human Rights Day, yesterday was International Anti-Corruption Day. And it's related anyway to human rights, as Michael outlined at the beginning of his presentation. My question is just around the feedback form, which is what was on the last slide for Michael. I think a lot of the issues that we talked about yesterday was around feedback, just closing that feedback loop. I wanted to ask Michael a little bit more about that and what government agencies perhaps, so even efforts which provide humanitarian assistance or coordination. These are some of the things that we can aspire to as we work during crises, and the expectations that or communities have of us when we are working with them.
Thank you, Ren. I'll pass the mic to Mr. Siale Michael, and then after that, I'll give you time to respond.
Thank you, sir. I don't have any answer to that. What I do have is that starting next year, we've already worked with Vani and her team last week to do a Tiango effort showing plan for next year. So what I would suggest Vani moving forward with is anticipatory action is to form some kind of a, I like to think like think tank. Let's use the language that you and them are using. Why not? Yes? Whether we understand what the participants are using. I think tank, some kind of a thing that we could come together and articulate more. My understanding of this anticipatory actions is more like an insurance system, yeah, where you put resources beforehand before there is any crisis. It is one of the main things that it does is to make sure that the response to affected communities is robust. And the way to do that is to push for donors to place the funds closest as close as it could be to the affected community. Yeah. So you can be looking at me in 5 years' time that I have a pot of money available whenever there's a cyclone happening in Fiji. We can do resource mobilization for ordinations in 24 hours. I don't know how to do that now, but that's what we would like to do. And we would need to have a group of people that think alike to really try to help us think this through. With our partnership with the card network, it's already happening. It's just a matter of identifying how we are going to proceed to advance on that. So it's quite exciting, but scary at the same time, because we don't really know it has not been done before. But it's all about innovation, and I think it's exciting. And I don't doubt that there are people in this room that would have a sense of how to move this forward. That's my other point is what Vani is talking about. I know it's addressed to Michael, but what we have seen year in, year out in how we respond to cyclones, that we just don't know how they're learning. It's like every year they come together to redo exactly what we did the last time. Because of how we deal with the feedback, I don't think it's something to do with the system. I think it's something to do with our hearts, how we accept other people criticizing our work. Because feedback is complaint. How do we accept people complaining about our services? And I think this is really the core of that in our region. We can have forms in every language, but if we don't feel like that we accept anyone expressing any of the complaints, I don't think that we will ever move from every year we will be talking about the same issues that we talked about 2 or 3 years ago. Thank you, Michael, for the presentation.
Thank you, Siale. I'll pass it to Michael to respond to the question on the feedback. And I know that we've been reminded yesterday by Mr. Azawa. It's not a complaint, it's a feedback. And Madam Siale laid it very nicely to us. It's not about what you receive, but it's how you receive it. Yeah? So it's about our heart. When we receive feedback from the community, that's not a complaint, that's a feedback. So pass it to Michael now to share with us about the feedback mechanism, the feedback loop that we shared in the last time. Hi, Michael, you still with us?
Sorry to say, I didn't quite get the question. The microphone's a little bit hazy.
I will ask Fanny to repeat the question again. Sorry about that.
Michael, the question is really just on the last slide on your presentation, which kind of provides some pointers for those who are looking seriously into developing or closing the feedback loop, and that's sort of a feedback mechanism and something that we might go into after this. I thought it was important to kind of flesh out some of the details in there. I think someone had it up on the, oh, Michael, you had it up on the screen. The feedback form.
Okay, I'll just bring that up on the screen.
Yeah, we've got some reps from some government department colleagues in the room. We also have national NGOs, so it's really an opportunity to learn from that. So that's the lesson for us. It's really, not complaining to feedback. So maybe we can speak on this a little bit so we can flesh out, because the next session is really about what our expectations are. When they're diagnosing how information is being available.
Okay, I'll just spend 1 or 2 minutes on this, but before I go to the feedback SOP that's on the screen, I just wanted to pick up from where Ciali left off, and I want to compliment both Piango and EFCOS for the work they've done as part of the UNICEF third-party monitoring effort. Some of the recommendations that come out of that third-party monitoring are really instructive, and I'll just read a quote from the recommendations. One of them is, there appears to be no systematic way to get community feedback or complaints and to communicate these to responsible authorities and or organisations, is one of the comments. Another comment that I would like to bring to light is that organisations should invest in equipping these community workers with the tools and the information they could use in delivering messages. One of the reasons I wanted to raise those 2 points is because when we're developing project proposals, as I think most people in the room appreciate, accountability to affected populations is one thing that is not really mentioned. It is not mentioned in the narrative more often than not, and it is certainly not mentioned in the budget. On top of that, if you go back to the strategic plans of many civil society organisations, they will not have a clear direction with respect to how they carry out community engagement. For me, accountability to affected populations is all about community engagement and should be central to any community engagement strategy, if in fact your organisation has one. Our focus in times of response is always on the key thematic areas that are well represented within the cluster system. Not so much, again, community engagement. However, of course, through community engagement, we engage with communities, those we're serving, those who have the least power within this situation. Looking at the feedback SOP, very simple. The 4 principles at the top: do ask for consent, do listen carefully, do document feedback, and do manage expectations. And I would reiterate, do manage expectations. Again, we're dealing with some extremely vulnerable people who are looking to grasp onto anything. Managing their expectations is central. Looking at the flow of this, again, very simple. As I mentioned previously, we have positive, we have neutral, and we have negative feedback. More often than not, you as a person engaging with the community on the ground will be able to answer the question, the comment directly without going through formal channels within your organization. However, if you can't do that, then you have to seek out other avenues. If that feedback is negative, of course, you need to look to your organization's sensitive feedback policy and procedures. And without doubt, that sensitive feedback will most likely have to be escalated throughout the organization, given that decisions based upon that sensitivity will have to be made, underlining the fact that confidentiality is critical, especially when we're talking about SGBV and PCH for that matter. Coming down, it asks, can you answer the question, the comment, the feedback internally? If you can do that, fantastic. But please communicate to the community where, how, and when they will receive a response. Far too often, feedback is given and it's not responded to, which undermines any trust that the community has in the feedback mechanism and or your community. If you are not able to answer the feedback, as I mentioned in my presentation, try to refer that on and explain how, when, where they will receive a response. Thanks for the question, Bunny.
Thank you, Michael. I'll take these last two questions for the benefit of time. I'll go with Aditya and Zulu before we get back for us.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you, Michael and Ciara, for those two presentations, but very informative. One thing I say, these are two presentations, they were parallel. They almost say the same thing, one by an international partner and one by a local partner. Very similar. This is how I get it wrong. Somebody has to correct me on this. However, this week we've been just talking about access to information. With these two presentations, what I find that, okay, you know, in the rights-based approach, there are two partners in any work. We, the people, we are the rights holders. We have the right to have information. The government and other development partners, they are the duty bearers. They are duty to serve us. We the people. I think most of us in the NGO community need to know that vocabulary. Rights holders, we the people, and the duty bearers, the duty to give us information and others. I just feel that what we're hearing is that the duty bearers have a lot of things, have a lot of information, what they need to do to us, to people. Those affected in a crisis or disaster. Are we, because this week we've been talking about access to information. Do the people know that these are the duties of the those who deliver support, aid and relief during a crisis? I doubt that they know. If they knew, maybe we should ask the development partners, Michael and Ciara, that you make sure that people know your duties. I mean, not only train our staff, and they need to know what actually your responsibilities to us, the community that are affected, and also the communities, they need to know what are their responsibilities, what to the crisis, benefits crisis. Because otherwise it's a one-way traffic. And you say, what is this, a two-way communication? And Mr. Rawak is talking about it. I am, it never occurred to me until I heard the two presentations today. The duty bearers, everything there for them. Okay, and after we can with the rights holders of people, we don't seem to be told what their duties and what only if we know their duties, then we know our rights. I think this is basically the bottom draw in this conversation. Maybe others would like to, are we informing the people? I don't know. Thank you.
Michael, I can see your slide is already up. We're going to take one more question, and then I will give you.
Thank you, Michael and Michelle, for the presentation. My name is actually probably a comment with the head of the discussion. Based on discussion yesterday and this morning, what I see is that the mechanism is on the ground. Whether it will still be in different forms, so dissemination, getting information in. Every time you visit communities and have done effectively both on the private sector, so recently, and now with semi-government entity. What you've seen is, and this is something that maybe you're familiar with it. Every time we say, oh, this information has already been taken, and so how long has it last 5 years? And yeah, we have people come up. So in the Turkey section, I think something you can add to your is Kacivaka. Kacivaka syndrome. Yeah, and I think it's talked about it, but it's clear. I put it like a non-time is that Kacivaka can go to Romanagi. And I'll just written in terms of my understanding. So we talk about access to information. We talk about disseminating information. We talk about how we are going to respond. And the way I feel is because receiving information, then the analyzing information, that's where probably we manage expectations. What I feel is lacking is the dissemination and response, which is key. Because once you do that, then you have a two-way communication. And also what I think is dissemination doesn't happen at the end stage, but in the feedback loop, it has to be in every part of the process. And our communities, those who have the right to the information, needs to be told so that they can know manage expectations, but also provide backup plans. It's no use taking them on a string and taking too much. Nothing happens. In terms of community response, one thing I probably just had to is that making is always the evidence-based policy. What I feel is that something we can discuss is, and this is probably my opinion, for your information. A lot of organizations or even government departments could be, they use the data as leverage. So they wouldn't want to share this information widely because they feel that the studies of the data and they want to benefit from the use of the data. So we are at a dilemma in which, again, last point, in terms of our right to information and also using data as leverage. And so you wouldn't want to share anything if you feel that you've done all of it and someone else will just come in, use the data and do their work. With a little bit of a give and take, and I'm not sure maybe the think tank established with that. So that is my very small contribution.
Thank you. Thank you, James, for your comment. It's lasting well with the ongoing discussions from yesterday, reminding us on the Kacivaka syndrome from the community, passing the information up. How can we have that feedback loop? It's a reminder and a reflection on how important is it for us to have that feedback loop. Yes, we're receiving feedbacks, not complaints from the community. How are we going to get the information back to them? And I think Michael will outline a little bit of the loop on how we can have that. And we're going to have a discussion. But for now, I'll pass it to Michael and also to CL to respond to Anti-Dam and also to James briefly on the other thing. Over to you, Michael.
Sorry, just to clarify that, Josiah. So the question was around how do we provide feedback to communities?
From Antigama. It's about information and on knowing our duty as duty bearers and also understanding the rights that the community has as a right holder, and how do we help one another to more like to act out these responsibilities that we have as right holders and also as duty bearers, and yes, getting information back to the community in that sense.
I think I've got your question again. Things are very hazy, so I'll do my best to answer what I think I've heard. If we're talking about ensuring that people understand their rights and their entitlements, then obviously that has to happen pre-disaster. And again, I go back to my point around community engagement strategies that each organisation should have, understanding that we don't have a presence in every community across Fiji, despite the fact that in the case of FCOS, they do have great courage. They do have great coverage through their 13 or 14 DCOS outposts. So in communities in which we do have courage and are at risk of disaster, then I do think those communities should be our priorities so as to ensure that they understand what their rights are. With respect to the messages that we communicate to them, many communities may not be particularly well informed about human rights. So of course, we have to adapt our messages so as they're appropriate to the audience. A very good example would be that in a place like PNG, you have a large portion of the population that are illiterate. So of course, you're not going to hand out pamphlets that articulate exactly what their rights are in times of crisis. Those kinds of communities really value face-to-face communication. Again, relying upon the third-party monitoring recommendations that have come out from FCOS and Piango, one of the things that it clearly states is that, yes, telephone, text, social media is wonderful, but there are still communities within Fiji who are not particularly responsive to that kind of media, especially people who have not grown up with that kinds of media, who lack trust in that kind of media, and who still very much value face-to-face communication if they are to trust the messages that are coming at them. I hope that goes some way to answering your question. Again, I just want to underline two things. One is the community engagement strategy that heavily incorporates accountability to affected populations. And number two, that a lot of the work we're talking about comes in the form of preparation. It can't be done during response because there simply is no time, especially if we're talking about sudden onset disasters. If we are talking about protracted crises, then of course the context is very different and our approach can be a little bit different given that we have a lot more time in which to respond. I hope I've made myself clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'll first of all to if I should like to respond to the discussion.
Thank you. In terms of are we communicating enough with our community? The answer is no. And there's an ongoing actions that we all need to. But at the same time, I think that there is no one that understands communities more than all of you in terms of how do we communicate those information. But at the same time, we need to make sure that those information is relevant to the context of our community. I think from I'm not sure when I make it clear, but from how Piango's work is that we recognize that the voices of our community are often not heard in how it's framed the development agenda. The donors of our development partners. And so a lot of the work that you have seen that we shared was very much part of the work that we do with EFCO, collecting the voices of our community and put it in a format that can be shared with our development partners to make sure that the resources are kind of channeled to the right agency. So that is support locally led actions. The other point that we also recognize that why we're doing this kind of work is that a lot of the data that we have are often not part of the official data that our government are using, right? Our stories, life experiences that are not often shared on paper, it's just shared among, like the information last night with the group circle. There's a different platform of how we hear the stories of our communities, that we need people like experts and us to take it and translate it into a format of how we can use it as an engaging platform with the development partners. In terms of going back to the community with those information, that's an ongoing challenge, and we need to continue talking about it and find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Michael. I'll stop the questions there, and I thank you again, Michael, for your time. And thank you so much for your very well articulated presentations to us this morning. And I hope that you will not leave us straight away, that you'll stick around with us and to help us through our next discussion that is on our group activities around applying AAG to our proposal principles that we discussed yesterday. So for us here in the room, morning tea is ready outside. However, before we dismiss for morning tea, I'll pass this time to Madam Executive Director for EFCOS to introduce our next activity before we break out for morning tea, so that we start articulate how we're going to do our next group activity before we convene again after morning tea.
Join me in thanking Michael and Sally. I also thank you. Of course, Pear has some late night cover, so I'm surprised that she's looking bright this morning. Whether that's a cover for the cover that she had last night, I don't know. We'll see after this. But thank you once again. It's going to be a working tea, so what we'll do is, because the tea's been ready since 10:30, we'll go out and get our tea. We'll try to put on some music. The one question that we want to ask, and you've already got a set of a summary of the recommendations that you had yesterday. Now, if you look at what has been distributed, what we have, your recommendations that's across the 5 groups, including government. When we looked at it, we analyzed it, we saw that there were 3 key things. Now, I don't know, I can ask the secretary back to print out what were your inputs and how we clustered it, and you can see how we come up with the 3 things. And again, there are 3 things that have emerged from what you recommended yesterday. And even though we were looking for principles, what we got out of your discussions were basically key asks, okay? Like key asks when you ask someone. There's so many things that we come up with, but these are key issues for you. So if you look at the 3 issues or 3 key asks, this is clustered under data collection, integrity, and issues of content, community content. Second, connection, coordination, and services. Right? Number 3, relationships and community capacity. Right? Now, if you are wondering how we got these 3 things, if you need it, we've got that summarized here. So all of the group discussions was put into, we analyzed it, and if you want to see how we tracked or how we clustered the things or the
so that they can be familiarized about these reports. For the second one, we want to add on 2 points, which is the involvement and consent and consultation with the Vanua. Second thing is strengthening network and partnerships with organizations that address the same issue to avoid duplication. Those are 2 points that we want to add more to this. For example, if you are in the community, collecting data and you find the issue on one, and you have other organizations that are doing one project, it would be better to network or partner with those organizations. This is an example of the and for the consultations to the Vanua, that means if we need anything or any development throughout the community, we need consult the Vanua and to be familiarized about the development that about the difference in the community. For the third one, one more thing, which is commitment and ownership to community development communities. This is monitoring support from stakeholders, which is government, NGOs, people, sports, etc. That's all from Team 1. Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Pear.
We don't have a ministry, but we will put it on paper. In terms of definition, we talked about, or we looked at 3 bundles, information provision, meaningful participation, and community feedback. And something that we look at across the 3 is the valuing information from the community and how when it's collected, it's distributed. And because we are the owners of the information, so when the information is collected, it needs to come back to me where the information is going. When it comes back to the we talked about lots of reports this morning. So when the report is launched, I need to know where it went to. And we talked about funding it when the report goes, because the information, suppose if there is one thing to like talk about information is fine. So you need to give back about to me and the owner. In terms of information provision, we talked about quality assurance, that when you give me or then there are surveys or research that comes to the community, there needs to be some of the talk about the ethics committee. We're not sure right now what the ethics committee is, but there needs to be qualifications in terms of the survey coming to the community. The community there's a lot of people that would be community. And something that we've been talking about is a day in the life of. You need to find out things at a time to come and talk to me. Perhaps you program already doing it. And then somebody comes at 5 o'clock in the morning, talking about what? Organization comes at 2 o'clock talking about what? It's not easy to talk together and stuff. So we have to do it. We talked about standards and systems that have to be formed. They have to just don't come there and talk about ILO having information. They go and they never come back. Where is the ethics in terms of that? The trying to collect information and there's nothing coming back. But in the morning, yesterday, we were talking about rights to information. Where is my information? Where does it keep? And does it keep there? Verification, there needs to be a verification system. We talked about safeguarding working on information provision. Safeguarding, we talked about the DO, we did not talk. We talked about the DO, the role of the DO, and its connection to the Turani Forum, and giving power to the Turani Forum as a person that safeguard information in the village or the district advisory council, like in terms of informed governance of the village. There's also coming up is there needs to be a localized mechanism or mechanism in terms of monitoring and evaluation. Because monitoring and evaluation is really just making sure that when you come and collect information or you provide information, you are able to the information that you take with us. And information provision, we feel very strongly about when we, and this is looking across to the initiatives, health affairs, somewhere in Scotland, is when we empower or the capacity develop to run the forum, whether it's a lady or a lady, the same information we give to the running forum, the village or community needs to know it. You know, there's a lot of smart parents. The information in terms of water, developing the capacity of the Turani Forum, sometimes develop, let's be honest, develop the food management into the past. Hopefully, give you some yellow notes and collect some pebbles to or gravel to do the road. Meanwhile, down the outline that is there won't get used. So, there needs to be a gateway for certain mechanism in villages or communities. And we all know that district advisory council one district advisory council can look after 3 or 5 communities. This is looking at when we give a collective portal, everybody in the village should know what the power is. Okay? Not how old. Everybody has the power to looking at meaningful participation. We talked about following pathways and gatekeepers and intentional engagement. Intentional engagement is or some organizations or communities and look at what happened. Okay? We would like to move in the bridge. 1 month later, have the bridge there. Meaningful or intentional engagement and in all of these we're talking about or we're just talking about pre-prior response. Yeah? In order for us to be here, you have got to put in that. Yeah? We talk about what's good and what's not so good. If it's something you don't like, you cannot. Yeah? we, when it comes to war, we talk a lot about the expected industry, yeah, and expectation is not so good, but it brings in money. Not more than yet, but in terms of preparing on content, there has to be content forms. The people coming in, we don't know, we can't stop anyone from coming into the community, but there has to be a pathway where people talk to each other. When somebody steps into the community, we ask the program for the 50% interview, sometimes we all get and all get what we want. Yeah? Yes. And that's the other person. So which means it is everybody's role to make that community. Community feedback, we strongly feel across around the table and at the back there, in terms of community feedback, it is essential that information is collected. Needs to come back to the openness of the information. We talk about storytelling, we are natural storytellers in the specific, but my story needs to be acknowledged. Don't take my story, write about it, and outcome you think you have to acknowledge that in my story. So that's from sensory. Thank you.
Any questions for them? Any point of clarification? Any comment? If not, you ready? Thank you, Ronnie and team.
Only thing we came up with was subvention. This I was not sure what subtopic, but everything everything go ahead and about that. All we did was done ahead. So I just asked already now. They haven't done anything with collecting that. So probably we told the same one. But it's we started with collecting data, and first time around was having feedback. Then we went around the field for AAP, and then civil tourism came next. And by the time we went around for civil tourism, the people in the communities, they were not that not like before, because the problem is with us, or actually we were really affected by PCR and the living planning of our PCR. And then I think maybe the first time we came around to ask for that, was maybe of the trauma and everything, they were expecting something to come back to them. Because right now, I think there has been a cycle from the communities to ask the course members, to the airports and to the government. There haven't been any feedbacks going back to it. So probably that is one of the major points that we are facing. Most of the time, there were the things that happened in our local part. Let's say, and we were doing this awareness, the PRR, they were thinking on top, they think on presentation of what the NGOs are representing to awareness,
for the Harbour or any second. And then halfway through the presentation, one of the village elders stopped them, and he asked them directly. He said, "Do you have anything with you? Is there something there with you that you can give to us? Can you contribute to the preparation of our education centers? We need 20,000. Can you give 20,000 in your pocket? Or are you just here, come and present, collect food, eat, next week you go to another place?" So I think that is the main reason people are starting to not contribute all their data with themselves. They're giving less. So I think there is no growth there. So the only thing we think is, I think, is the feedback. We need to give them feedback so that we don't lose the effect. We need to complete the effect. We do not do this that can be easily broken or with this man. We need to complete it. The report was presented over. We have also identified some of the key things pertaining to accountability when dealing with the local communities and those practices of the communities, and also how like the process involved when we collect data and then we also assure that the whole process, whether that will lead to one, how we report them, and also the issues of protection, how do we assure them that we are dealing with in a professional manner and not to expose some of that private information, and also there's another issue of digital accessibility, and then how we transform into the digital into digitalization, and then what are alternative forms to reach those who are in the interior communities without projects, and how do we deal with that, and also sustainability in the process, and also how do we maintain diplomatic stakeholders, not to beat them off our sources and all those things. How do we deal with them diplomatically? And also to also allow space for feedback from the communities, and also the policy influence and advocacy. How do we get the diversity influence policies and the advocacy to benefit the community? Thank you.
Not any questions for that? Any feedback? No. Thank you guys
We talked about the online digital capacity, and I think the one important is how to definitely with the task. That's like information in place. So that's the one for marketing. The what Dale was talking about. So it's the how do we keep our information?
we go to myself that to indicate an answer.
Thank you, ma'am. When I got you for this book publication and my contribution with information comes our responsibility. When we actually go out into the field to extract information from our community, it's a big responsibility on us. As you were saying, they have been conducting surveys when not in community, and that's something that they have found out. Like first survey and then the second time, and then the next time they come in, villages, they start to contact information. Because as I take them opening the carpet, that gets there. Nowadays, people actually want to hear out of what we do. So I think that's really important to when we actually go out to get the information from people, we always have a part to create, also have a responsibility to the people who we serve. So thank you. Before the report is outside,
We'll behave at the time deadline.
When you see young people or something in articulate things, which is one to ask first. Because they're very, it's very inspiring to see young people coming in and share the experiences from the ground. It's just a comment. The presentation that there a silent expectation from our community when we go to ask for things. We're going to do a survey, yeah? And we are not, we don't often tell them exactly where we're at, and we don't really transparent about, how we're going to use the result or how we're going to use the information. And oftentimes we are, breaking expectations. So for me, whether that's something that we need to recognize, that there might be some silent expectation from our community. It's not just exchange of funds or things like that, that we need to be transparent details, but also maybe about how we engage our community with the collecting of data. Thank you.
I would just like to respond to what about digital information privacy content. I think when we talk about digitalization and those transformations, there are governing laws and regulations in place that protect us. And moving forward, we just raise the need to go to the support period of getting these guys, all of the information made available. So there is a digital disease that presented yesterday on how those transformation will be done according to law and regulations.
And the people not for the report. Especially the probably need to when a community gets over research. That is the issue. When community dealing with crisis, or the development agencies and get in the community, they get over this. No one, and I think we have to understand the reaction. The reaction to be over this. And it is civic. How do we cope? How do we address the feeling of being over the we're trying to their personal lives? This thing for themselves, this when workforce, when feed themselves, find food and other things. That's one. The issue of being over the. What do development actors like ourselves here do? Here is what that really. We've always said really first before data. Really, that instantly soon after a disaster. But on the other hand, you have vision affairs, because they actually have data. They actually have data, and they're not releasing it. They said they will only release the development plan. Now I think so. They only release the development plan. Are we asking for data that's already enough? And can we, I mean, this is another issue. Maybe vision affairs might want to respond to me. Thanks. When it comes to disaster, I think that data made available to the coordination, the PA officer. So that is where you can access that information. So I like the coordination officer when it comes to disaster.
Can we move to the next group?
As has been mentioned by during disaster, nobody asks baseline information, but we need to provide them all the available. Recreate the emergency operation centers, and the purpose of the emergency operation centers is to inform government and non-government bodies to come and we are coordinated. We can easily get information from the emergency. I have another thing. That's the development of the community. When you walk into the breath and go, what has been said about participation of the community, the community, but we must begin with that. Sometimes we walk in and we walk back with our collective. The full extent of the information is required. The decision is made and quick response would be delivered at the same time. In terms of humanitarian assistance. How can we do the trust to the community? That's my point. Maybe we can engage provincial administration, staff of the provincial administration, or the staff of the county affairs, which is the Rocky system Rocco, who can always walk into the community with our NGO officers and ask the community to get in the community. Because at the community level, this is how things have been working for some years. When they see property comes in, people respect. They will be able to give the full content of the requirement that comes from the case there. I'm just putting one example, just giving an example how can we work better and get better results from the community.
Take that last comment before we move to the next group.
Thank you. I think I would, if just sharing from experience that we've had encountered with yeah, so thank you very much for alluding on to the fact that we coordinating, the fact that we should be doing this, but I think that we need to enforce more and try to work together on this note, because when we start to strike, many times, as we said yesterday, different we go at different period of time. Okay? So we arrive at the destination at a different period of time. I'm giving an example on the note whereby there was this tornado who just uprooted one whole community in Thailand, and the first responders came in with their promises. So when we as NGO came in, they shut down on us. When we asked for, we said go to the office. When we asked for that data, somehow it was reluctantly shared. I don't know what was the reason behind it. I don't know what is the embedded reason that needs to be followed on how to access this data, but somehow the people coordinating mechanism and the arm of working together is better. I think here is probably the platform that we really need to speak about on how we can work together, really help our communities, and not really to be responding on different ways and giving out different results. Just so we can be projecting the same thing that we really want to be better for the community. Same thing as we are talking about collecting data, same thing as we are talking about when we are responding to our needs. Thank you.
I'll give this time to the second last speaker.
Under number one, data collection, integrity and issues of consent. Decided to maybe touch on 3 points. One is having updated the data, field data collection, from field data collection to final analysis. Basically, improving your data collection as data is on the ground. We capture the real-time information, and that way you want to achieve the data being particular and related to the actual situation on the ground. Moving on to the second one, data accessibility, improving access, making sure that there is transparency around data accessibility, and that is data sharing, which is a challenge that is shared by 2 of the groups that have already presented. And a bit on that point, legislation for data sharing on the Disaster Act is the Office of the Rural Disaster Act. In which case, if you need the access to the data during Pear, the provision of get the information is not directly in the community and not to the other department, but directly to the Office of the PAC directly. Moving on to number 2, which is connection, coordination, and services. The first point we wanted to touch on was to stay connected with the communities, social media updates daily, radio talk shows through every form of mass media possible, including verbal communication, word of mouth, and in all dialects, in all languages, and where possible, as far as possible, in every dialect in that level. Say, for example, if you go to school and then you understand power cell, even though you might be bringing in counseling services of the humanitarian for DRR, if they can understand what you're trying to say, let alone what you're trying to help them with through counseling, forget about achieving that objective, and they will definitely end up participating. So, number two is village visitations and outreach, basically extending the arm of connections, arm of coordination to improve service delivery. And this is achieved through a term that we are all familiar with by now, relationship management. Not just by the institutionalized authority on that matter, but by all stakeholders involved. And lastly, on number two is connected to GSOs, NGOs, etc. Co-embraced by another colleague yesterday to recognize the volunteers and the volunteer organizations in our communities. Not only recognize, appreciate them, also including them in the operation. That way too is a way of streamlining systems that prevent situations whereby one organization comes in, they don't go to the page of, they take the indirectly to the business. They take the supplements, organization number two are that takes the supplements, one household will get 2, 3, 4 supplements, another community they need the supplements, they should have it. So in a way, connecting with these years also you building up your network so that when they are self-respect, there's already a coordinated response whereby the office will be able to provide. Like what we have in several numbers, we profile by NGO type, other type of assistances they offer, and where those assistances are facts. This information facts and initiatives, we outline specifically what they take. That way, when aid is needed, wherever it is needed, and when our partners, CSOs, NGOs, they come through the process and the effect of the other, we are able to effectively coordinate to get what is needed to a initiated or type without a notification. Moving on to number 3, relationships and community capacity. First one we decided to touch on was regular orientation for community health workers, drone forest, etc. Migration of data, basically data data. Real-time updates, relationship management, and above all, making sure that what is discussed in a forum where only community health workers sit, where only advisory councillors sit, where only family forums sit, where only maternity clinics sit, those information does go back to the community level forum, which is the most important. But the women's rep on that forum for the most nyata takes that development information back to the community level in the village of the center, relays that where there is the working group that will need to implement or apply for the respective categories. Second and final one from the government conference this morning is to report feedback and act on it. Something clearly was by the CDM presentation yesterday to lock in and close that feedback the communication channel. That's all from government this morning.
My question is directed at the verification factor in terms of disaster response. I'm speaking from experience. There have been a few times where we go into the community to get the data and we found out the certification service. So who do we verify with the government? Is there information that we can readily access in terms of correct data? And also with the providing core, what is the person that needs to verify the data for us after our collection of data? Yeah, that's my question. Because when the time we give the forms to the individual family, they give us information that they have not been assisted,
but they already used it. So, who to talk to from the government, you know, from the government side? Do we have a connector? Do you have it? And who do we talk to together with us?
Thank you for the question, Madam. Very question indeed. And this is an area whereby a lot of conversations, if not already happening, is to have ensuring that the data is not only timely and regularly updated, but that it's also acted on the government. Like I said, for humans, they are greatest assets, but they also are greatest challenge for many. So in terms of having connected, I think that falls back on us, relevant government authorities. It would be a phase where there is a consent, ladies and time adjustments consent, to enhance our monitoring mechanism to make sure that we don't just accept the report, compile the supplement, and present the data for the settlement, but we actually do have a vetting mechanism in place aside from the signature to ensure that we actually make sure what's on the ground is exactly what's on the report and nothing more, nothing less in real time. I think that answers your question, and when that starts to happen, that allows for the accurate data. When we have that accurate data, the way to access it is through the PA's office in the respective province.
We talked about following the profession. I for one would say with the community work that I've been doing with the Rewa and the Kacivaka area, have been following the proper channels on how to get to the community which I want to go with. So yeah. But just a question on how, because the fact that you've explained it so well, you have sort of put out a clear dynamic on how well structured that this system, the channel within the government or within the national level, in area. My question, how are you planning to among yourselves? How well are you? Because one of the challenges that I faced, I collected data from one of the area and I was asked to give the data. I don't mind sharing. I don't mind the collected information that I got, but the fact that whom I got the permission to go to the ground from did not have the data in which I was supposed to collect to share. I was quite impacted by that. I felt that there was just a sitting thought within that story. So how does it work?
Thank you for the question.
You would like to take a few minutes?
That is definitely very important. And as I mentioned, in the government machinery is clearly outlined. And so are the channels to follow. Administering that machinery is a human, a person, which is a both a great asset and a great challenge to manage. So, if in your respective districts, you face the challenge of either a lack of data or non-real titles or non-disaggregated data according to the categories that you would preferably have or you want, but you find that other provinces have. that full spectrum answer in this question. And I would ask forgiveness on behalf of the legislators in the area where you are residential. And I would ask for colleagues from the respective ministries concerned to take this back as an essential learning that we need to improve on in terms of our customer service to you.
This was to take this relationship management. So this is a platform where you can build those relationships. You can check that. Although human being is a great asset, it's also a great challenge to manage. So let's have this conversation, something that we're going to do, they're not aware of, something that they know that we do not know. So the next 2 hours that we have here, I ask them to utilize the sound very well. And you can also go and answer as many questions as you want. So we will move to our group so that we can go out for lunch. The reminder will be sitting between you and lunch. So, for time, we can do it briefly at the because of time limitations, we will speak. It's been a very good learning for us, but we try to also discuss the three topics. But let me just first summarize what we've heard. The first one, maybe we get, I've heard a lot of words about ownership of data. Perhaps we challenge us to move from ownership to custodian. Let us view ourselves as custodian for the data, because I think custodian comes with a responsibility. So that's something to think about. We also talked about donor fatigue. Exactly, donor fatigue, even answering so many questions. The community engagement week, I've already told my colleagues, community engagement is not like buying bread. I can go back to the office, deliberate, and then come back with the life things after today. Something to think about it. So, moving into what we represent is one community for social ideas. In terms of community preparedness, we something that we discussed with using both the formal and informal group engagement sessions to collect information. So, many times with the expectations, we are only thinking about formal program. But even the Salma, which is a big one now in many platforms, is still relevant. Maybe just taking time to know, understand your community better as a human being before working in area of the institution you're representing. On that point, we talked about sharing from communities to share information among agencies. We noted that government is good influence. In our section where we there's also a need to share information, but with double thinking and with donor fatigue. But then we have to look at the issue of consent from communities to be able to share this data. We also discussed that information is power. I think that we said many times. But we'd like to add to that notion. Information is only power if we use it. So use it to inform and leverage it. In terms of the donor fatigue, I think we need to, the community is all about valuation. What do you bring this into the community? And not just about physical or donations of funds, but also linking them to our institutions or providing them with information that if you are, this is what's happening out there. I may not be able to help you this time in this, it is not under my but I can connect you. And maybe, so maybe also can get compensation for information gathering. At the higher level, if I pay so much money to publish or run a report on a community, we end up probably don't get nothing. And if we wait their time, community time, we say they give up, perhaps, they have things to look into that. Speaking of business, we need to relook at the mode and method of engagement of communities. Again, it comes back to doing your homework and understanding what works and what doesn't. There needs to be intense consultation and inclusive of diverse groups. I've noted, sharing with the people is that every time you go to a particular community, you always have a group that goes with that. And in the particular society, we can have women in the meeting, but they're not back. So they are not there to speak up. So I think the method of data collection and how we cut this needs to be probably sort of more. We also talk about shifting the power and sharing the resources. So you feel that the community and the organization that deal with them, you sometimes the risk is always an expectation is always on the organization that you represent. And maybe because it's just a top-down approach, even though we get information from the ground, how we view our communities, maybe they don't need to shift the power. We can only do that if we have formalized agreement between communities and service providers, especially the human services. So now you bring your community as a partner. When you do that, you can also shift from contractual to partnership, and that comes back to relationship. So you provide that platform where the community puts on the cap, they are perhaps they are and they are interviewed. I play important as your member. So the last bit is about community feedback. We already talked about community feedback and talked about it. But actually, the key thing is money feedback. Not it's expensive. It's expensive. And many times in our marketing project, we maybe if someone maybe others, we do not focus on this issue. We know issue. We have to go back and forth with communities. Our suggestion is maybe you have a budget and program for it. Because goes back to, it's not like buying a program. Walk in, walk out, and expect that everything is going through. Again, going back and forth, it's expensive. And the people who do that need to be compensated, but also intervention. Compensated effectively. And the last one is recording of feedback and categorizing them. So, last one is literacy. There's also talk about literacy and all the stuff. But, we realize that in the community, there's different ways of communicating, understanding, and articulating. I think it's about recording the method that they are more comfortable with. The onus is on us, I mean, demystify, or maybe put in some form that the comfortability is there. So you put what said, this is what it is. When you come back to the community, you just verify that we talked about this, what we said, is it still relevant? And before coming with that can solve this issue where, sorry, the real issue of, you can have a big land, you go, but you go to 6 months, but you come back The company is already presented on, already budgeted for traveling. And it'll take you another 6 months to get, but the approval is still there to maybe approve. So very briefly, that is our contribution. So if you have any questions, you can ask, later. Any questions or questions? If 2 or 3.
Share how we learn, we collect our data through our government and this is what we did. We divided it into 3 wards. There is the eastern ward, and there is the central ward, and there is the western ward. So there is the head of the eastern ward, there is the head of the central ward, there is the head of the western ward. The communities, they submit to their individual communities through the profiling system that we have prepared. When they submit to the communities submit to the individual heads. The eastern ward, they submit to the eastern head. And the eastern head ward submit to the executive. It's the same as the central and it's the same as the western. Also, on the ground, what we have seen, while the course is going, also the technical is accompanying them. Not one day after another. It's on the same day. And the tech officers are also taking their profiling from the government. So when they compare, they have achieved all the data that goes up to the government and different goes up to the government. That is how we achieve our model through love and faith, through love and trust, we will live the world. So the tech boxes, they are divided into 3 groups. One is from the eastern world, one is from the western world, and one tech box is from the western world. So by splitting the tech boxes and splitting the world heads, they will be collecting all the data within the respective areas. So we won't be missing out. Our hope, if you can do the same. You use the tech officers and you use your NGO officers, your DCOS officers to work with them, you won't pay. You will collect all the required data that you need. And the data, what we need, once you get the data, you will know the financial strength in our family. Once you the data is like a TV. Once you get the data, you know the financial strength in this family. You know if they feel in need or they can support themselves, or they are paying how many disabilities. Also, we need government providing system that they have. What type of light, what type of road, what type of water. All that is in the government side and also the NGO. When you collect those two together, you have a lot of information about that family. And when you have the financial strength of that family, then you will have the financial strength of the settlement. And when you have the financial strength of the settlement, then you will know the financial strength of the eastern wall, central wall, the western wall. Then when you have those three, then you will have the financial strength of the whole district of Pear. So that is how I prepare that.
One last comment or question to the team. You are within the group element.
I think it is something that we really need to work on with regards to strengthening the work that we do. But one of the experience that we had as volunteers was, when COVID came out, the Commissioner's office was working with gatekeepers. But the data that they were collecting was something different from what we were having with from the ground. They projected a 100% coverage awareness, but when we came to those areas and speak to the gatekeepers within those areas, they haven't been visited. So it's something that we really need to work together towards strengthen on how can we better channel the coordination work that we are doing right now, that we are sort of really. So yeah, from my end, that's it. Thank you.
Just in regards to working partnership with our stakeholders and our stakeholders and NGOs, I was being told by that it's a good time for you to acknowledge partnership that was done through the COVID-19 response that we had and through the fight we just did. We'd like to take this opportunity as Western request to thank our partners in working with us throughout the COVID-19 response. Cyber Foundation and Global Compassion for giving us opportunities to distribute to the vulnerable in the community. And because of the data we had, this is because of our sharing data. The data we had, not only from us, it was also from our subnational level, from our DOs and our current forums and our advice council. They gave us data so that we would give to you to be able to help those that are in need. So I'd like to take this time to salute you all for the good work that you're doing in partnership with us. We were able to help the community that really needed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson of Five People, and also a member of our National Executive Committee. And that brings us to a close of this session. We thank you all for your deliberations and your thinking around the three acts that we feel from yesterday. We are breaking up for lunch after this, and when we're back from lunch, we will be discussing the outcome of this discussion, drawing from your